The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Clint Eastwood's ranch-style home in Carmel-by-the-Sea, California. At 94 years old, the legendary filmmaker had settled into a quieter rhythm of life. His days of waking before dawn for film shoots had long passed, replaced by peaceful mornings with coffee on his porch overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Eastwood shuffled to his kitchen in well-worn slippers, his tall frame still impressive despite the slight stoop that came with it. He poured himself a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just as he had done for 7 decades in Hollywood. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of waves crashing against the shoreline. The phone rang, breaking the morning. Silence. Eastwood considered letting it go to voicemail. These days, he was selective about which calls he took. Most were from producers pitching projects, journalists seeking interviews, or organizations requesting appearances. At his age, he'd earned the right to say no more often than yes. Something made him pick up this time. Hello? His voice still carried that unmistakable gravelly quality that had become his trademark. Mr. Eastwood, this is Tom Reynolds from Tonight with America. Eastwood knew the show well. It was currently the most watched late-night program in the country, hosted by Pete Jackson, a man Eastwood respected for his straightforward interview style. "What can I do for you, Tom?" Eastwood asked, taking another sip of his coffee. "We'd like to invite you to be our special guest next month. Not just for a regular interview, we want to do something different. A full hour dedicated to your career." Eastwood chuckled softly. "That's very kind, but I'm not much for the spotlight these days." "I understand, sir," Tom replied. "But this isn't about promoting anything. We want to celebrate your legacy. 7 decades of contributions to American cinema. No agenda, no politics, just recognition of your work." Eastwood walked to his living room window, phone in hand, looking out at the garden his late wife had planted years ago. The roses were in bloom. "I appreciate the offer, but I've done my share of retrospectives over the years," he said. There was genuine appreciation in his voice, but also finality. Tom paused before continuing. "What if I told you we've been contacted by several actors and filmmakers you've worked with? They reached out to us when they heard we were planning this." This caught Eastwood's attention. "Who exactly?" "I'd rather not say specifically. They want it to be a surprise. But people whose careers you helped shape. Some you haven't seen in years." Eastwood's mind drifted to the many actors he'd directed over the decades, the young talents he'd given breaks to, the veterans whose careers found second wins in his films. He thought of the crews he'd worked with, many becoming like family over multiple productions. "Mr. Eastwood, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here," Eastwood replied, his thoughts returning to the present. "When exactly would this be?" 3 weeks from now. Tuesday the 15th. Eastwood walked over to his desk and checked his calendar. A paper one, as he still preferred writing things down by hand rather than using the electronic devices his grandchildren had tried to get him to adopt. "I'd need to move some things around," he said, though there wasn't much written on the pages. The truth was, at his age, he kept his schedule intentionally light. "We'd make it as easy as possible," Tom assured him. "Private transportation, minimal. Prep time, whatever you need to be comfortable." Eastwood sat down in his leather chair, the one he'd had for over 30 years. It had molded to his body over time, like an old friend. "Let me think about it," he said finally. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the firm no he usually gave. "Of course. Could I call you tomorrow for your decision?" After hanging up, Eastwood sat in contemplation. He'd largely stepped back from public appearances in recent years. At his age, every commitment required careful consideration. Energy wasn't infinite anymore. Later that afternoon, his daughter Katie stopped by with lunch, a weekly tradition they'd maintained for years. "You seem distracted today, Dad," she noticed as they ate sandwiches on the patio. "Everything okay?" Eastwood told her about the call. To his surprise, Katie's expression brightened immediately. "That's Pete Jackson's show. You should do it. His interviews are always thoughtful, never gossipy." "I've done enough looking back in my life," Eastwood replied. "Not sure what's left to say that hasn't been said." Katie put down her sandwich and looked at her father directly. "Maybe it's not about what you have to say. Maybe it's about what others want to say about you." Her words hung in the air between them. Eastwood had never been one to seek validation or praise. He'd built his career on the principle that the work should speak for itself. Accolades and tributes made him uncomfortable. "I've had plenty of recognition in my life, Katie. Awards, tributes, standing ovations. I'm grateful, but I don't need more." "This isn't just about you, though," she said gently. "Think about the people whose lives you've impacted. Maybe they need the chance to say thank you." That evening, after Katie left, Eastwood found himself watching one of his older films on television. Not one of the iconic westerns or action movies, but a smaller, more personal project he'd directed in the 1990s. He watched the performances of actors he'd cast, some who were established stars, others who were unknowns he'd taken chances on. He remembered the young camera assistant on that film who'd lost his father during production. Eastwood had paid for the funeral privately when he learned the family was struggling financially. The young man had gone on to become a successful cinematographer, working on 3 more of Eastwood's films. There was also the actress who'd been battling addiction, but showed such promise in her audition that Eastwood fought with the studio to cast her. She'd stayed clean throughout the shoot, and had since become an advocate for recovery, crediting Eastwood with saving her career when no one else would take a chance. These weren't stories Eastwood told. They weren't in his official biography, or mentioned in interviews. They were just moments of human connection that happened away from cameras and publicity. The phone rang again just as the movie ended. "Dad?" It was his son Kyle. "Katie told me about the TV show invitation." "News travels fast," Eastwood said with a slight smile in his voice. "You should do it," Kyle said without hesitation. "You too, huh? What's going on with you kids?" "Just think it would be good. You don't do many of these anymore." After they hung up, Eastwood walked out onto his deck. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He'd chosen this home for these sunsets, for the quiet, for the distance from Hollywood's constant noise. His phone buzzed with a text message from his youngest daughter. "Do the show, Dad. Trust me on this one." Eastwood shook his head, chuckling to himself. Something was definitely up with his children. They were never this insistent about his public appearances. In fact, they were usually protective of his privacy, understanding his desire for a quieter life in recent years. The next morning, Tom Reynolds called again as promised. "Have you had time to consider our invitation, Mr. Eastwood?" Eastwood looked at the family photo on his desk, a recent one from last Christmas with his children and grandchildren. All these people who had somehow found time in their busy lives to urge him to do this show. "I'll do it," he said finally, "but I have conditions." "Of course, anything. No surprise questions about politics, no ambushes with people I've had public disagreements with, and I want final approval on any clips or footage you plan to show." "Absolutely," Tom agreed quickly. "This is a celebration, not an expose. We want you to be comfortable." After finalizing the details, Eastwood hung up and immediately received a text from Katie. "Did you say yes?" How she knew about the call already was a mystery, but one that made him increasingly suspicious that there was more to this invitation than a simple career retrospective. What Eastwood didn't know was that at that very moment, in a production office in Los Angeles, Tom Reynolds was on a conference call with Pete Jackson and Eastwood's family members. For the past 6 months, they had been secretly gathering footage, interviews, and stories from dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Eastwood's quiet acts of kindness throughout his career. He said yes, Tom announced to the group. The room erupted in excitement. The plan they'd been working on for nearly a year was finally coming together. Back in Carmel, Eastwood went about his day with no idea of what was being prepared. He took his usual afternoon walk along the beach, nodding politely to neighbors who respectfully maintained his privacy. In 3 weeks, he would step back into the spotlight, expecting nothing more than a standard career tribute. He could not have imagined how that night would unfold, or how it would reveal to the world a side of Clint Eastwood that the cameras had never captured before. The 3 weeks passed quickly. The night before the show, Eastwood stayed in a hotel suite in downtown Los Angeles that the production had arranged. He'd spent the afternoon going through old photographs with his daughter Katie, who had insisted on joining him for moral support. She'd brought along a leather-bound album filled with family pictures and behind-the-scenes shots from his movies spanning 7 decades. "Remember this one?" Katie asked, pointing to a faded photo of Eastwood directing his first film. "Play Misty for me." Eastwood nodded, touching the edge of the photo. 1971. "I was terrified, though I never let the crew see it." They continued through the album until Katie closed it and checked her watch. "You should get some rest, Dad. Big day tomorrow." After she left, Eastwood laid out his clothes for the show. A simple charcoal suit, light blue shirt, no tie. At his age, he'd earned the right to be comfortable. He went to bed early but found himself lying awake, thinking about his long career and the countless faces that had been part of his journey. Something about this show felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on why. The next morning brought the familiar pre-appearance routine: the car service, the production assistants with their clipboards and headsets, the green room with its spread of untouched food. Eastwood sipped water, declining the offer of coffee. His stomach felt unsettled, which surprised him. After all these years, he rarely got nervous before appearances. A young production assistant named Bobby kept checking on him every few minutes. "Mr. Eastwood, is there anything else you need?" he asked for the 3rd time. "I'm fine, son. But you might want to relax a little yourself before you wear out the carpet." Bobby laughed nervously. "Sorry, sir, it's just, well, this is a big night for the show." "Just another interview," Eastwood replied with a shrug. "Right, of course." Bobby nodded too enthusiastically before backing out of the room. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. The kid was definitely hiding something. A gentle knock came at the door, and Pete Jackson, the show's host, entered. Unlike Bobby, Pete carried himself with the easy confidence that came from interviewing presidents and movie stars for over 15 years. "Clint," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Thanks for doing this. Been trying to get you on the show for years." Eastwood shook his hand firmly. Seemed like the right time. Pete sat down across from him. "I wanted to run through how tonight will go. First segment is just you and me talking about your early career, the westerns, the transition to directing. Second segment, we'll look at some clips from your films, get your thoughts on them. Then after the break, I know the drill." Eastwood interrupted gently. "Been doing these since before you were born." Pete smiled. "Fair enough. Any topics you want to avoid?" "Already gave my conditions to your producer. No politics, no ambushes." "Absolutely. Tonight's about celebrating your work, nothing else." There was something in Pete's expression, a slight twinkle in his eye that made Eastwood wonder again if there was more to this appearance than he'd been told. Before he could question it, a floor manager appeared at the door. "5 minutes, Mr. Jackson." Pete stood and straightened his tie. "See you out there. And Clint, thanks again. This means a lot to many people." Left alone, Eastwood stood and checked his appearance in the mirror. The face looking back at him had more lines than he remembered, the famous squint now permanently etched around his eyes. Time had been fair but honest with him. He ran a hand through his silver hair and took a deep breath. A different production assistant appeared. "We're ready for you, Mr. Eastwood." As he followed her through the backstage labyrinth, Eastwood could hear the show's opening music and Pete's voice warming up the audience. The energy in the building was palpable. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Pete's voice boomed through the speakers, "please welcome one of the greatest filmmakers and actors in the history of American cinema. A man who has defined toughness, integrity, and artistic excellence for 7 decades, the legendary Clint Eastwood." The floor manager gestured for Eastwood to walk out. As he stepped onto the stage, the studio lights momentarily blinded him. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw the audience rising to their feet, applauding with an intensity that caught him off guard. The ovation continued as he crossed the stage to shake Pete's hand. It went on so long that Eastwood, never comfortable with extended applause, gestured for everyone to sit down. They didn't. If anything, the cheering grew louder. Finally, after nearly 2 full minutes, the audience began to return to their seats. Eastwood settled into the guest chair, trying to appear more comfortable than he felt. "Well," Pete said, "I think they're happy to see you." "Seems that way," Eastwood replied with his characteristic understatement. "Not sure what all the fuss is about." That got a laugh from the audience, breaking the tension. Only 7 decades of unforgettable performances and masterful directing, Pete said. Just a small contribution to American culture. Eastwood shrugged. Just doing what I loved. "Let's start at the beginning," Pete said, leaning forward. "Rawhide, 1959. You were 30 years old when you got the role of Rowdy Yates. Did you have any idea then where that path would lead?" Eastwood settled into the conversation, finding his rhythm. He spoke about his early days, the struggle to be taken seriously as more than just a tall, handsome cowboy. He shared stories about working with director Sergio Leone on the spaghetti westerns that would redefine his career. "He barely spoke English and my Italian was terrible," Eastwood recalled, "but somehow we understood each other. What I learned from Leone was that silence could be more powerful than dialogue, that a character could say more with a look than with a speech." The audience hung on every word. Eastwood had always been economical in interviews, but tonight he found himself opening up more than usual. There was something about the atmosphere in the studio, a warmth and appreciation that made the words come easier. Pete was a skilled interviewer, knowing when to probe deeper and when to simply let Eastwood talk. They moved through the 1970s, the Dirty Harry films that became cultural landmarks, his early directing efforts. "You won your first Oscar for directing Unforgiven in 1992, Pete said. "Was that validation important to you?" Eastwood thought for a moment. It was gratifying because Unforgiven was a Western, and Hollywood had largely written off that genre. The film was about an aging gunfighter coming to terms with his violent past. There's something appropriate about that being the one to finally get recognition. They showed clips from several of his films, and Eastwood provided brief commentary on each. For a man known for looking forward rather than back, he found himself enjoying this trip through his filmography more than he'd expected. As they headed into a commercial break, Pete leaned over during the station identification. "You're doing great. The next segment is going to be special." "Special how?" Eastwood asked, his suspicion returning. Pete just smiled as the floor manager counted them back in. "We're back with Clint Eastwood," Pete announced. "And now we're going to do something a little different." Eastwood felt a slight tension in his shoulders. This was where interviews sometimes went off the rails, when hosts sprang surprises that guests weren't prepared for. "Over the past 6 months," Pete continued, "we've been collecting something unique. Not just clips from your movies, but moments that the public has never seen. Behind-the-scenes footage that shows a side of Clint Eastwood that few people know exists." Eastwood frowned slightly. "What kind of footage?" "I think it's better if we just show you," Pete said, turning toward the main screen. "Ladies and gentlemen, we present the man behind the camera, Clint Eastwood's unseen legacy." The studio lights dimmed, and Eastwood turned toward the screen with growing curiosity and a touch of apprehension. Whatever was coming, he hadn't been prepared for it. He glanced briefly toward the wings of the stage, where he spotted his daughter Katie standing with the production team, watching him intently. The screen began to glow, and Eastwood's attention was drawn back to it. The image that appeared wasn't from one of his famous films, but something he'd never expected to see on national television. And in that, the screen flickered to life with grainy footage that Eastwood immediately recognized from the set of $1,000,000 Baby nearly 20 years ago. The camera wasn't the main production camera, but appeared to be behind-the-scenes footage shot by someone on the crew. Eastwood watched himself talking quietly with Hilary Swank between takes. He remembered the moment. She had been struggling with a particularly emotional scene and had asked for his guidance. What surprised him was that someone had been filming their conversation. "I don't understand what she's feeling," Swank said. In the footage, her voice barely audible. The Eastwood on screen moved closer to her, away from the busy crew. "Don't try to understand it, feel it. Remember when you told me about your grandfather, how he looked at you the last time you saw him? Find that moment and live in it." The footage shifted to the actual scene they'd been filming. The difference In Swank's performance before and after their talk was striking. It was raw, honest, and ultimately earned her an Oscar. The screen transitioned to a different set, a different film. Gran Torino, Eastwood recognized. The footage showed him working with a young Hmong actor who had never been in a film before. "I can't do this," the young man said, clearly frustrated after multiple takes. The Eastwood on screen put a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you can. You're thinking too much. Don't act. Just be. But I keep forgetting the lines. So forget them. Tell me what you're trying to say in your own words. I'll listen." The footage showed them working through the scene. Again, the young man speaking more naturally, Eastwood responding in the moment rather than sticking strictly to the script. The result was a scene that felt authentic and unforced. Eastwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. These were private moments, not meant for public viewing. Yet there was nothing embarrassing about them, just glimpses of his directing process that few outside the industry had seen. The montage continued with similar moments from various films, Eastwood giving gentle guidance to actors young and old, experienced and novice. There was footage of him stepping in when a crew member was being berated by a producer, quietly but firmly redirecting the conversation. Another clip showed him sitting with an elderly extra who had become overwhelmed by the long shooting day, making sure she was comfortable and respected. What struck Eastwood as he watched was how ordinary these moments seemed to him. This was simply how he worked. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, just basic human decency and respect for the craft. The footage shifted to something more personal. It was from the set of The Mule, one of his more recent films. A young production assistant had collapsed during a hot day of outdoor shooting. The cameras captured Eastwood not only stopping production immediately, but riding in the ambulance with the young man to the hospital. Eastwood remembered that day. The assistant had suffered heat exhaustion, nothing life-threatening, but Eastwood had stayed with him until his family arrived. He'd never told anyone about it, and he was surprised that cameras had captured the moment. The screen went black for a moment, then text appeared. The following stories have never been shared publicly until now. The face of a middle-aged man appeared on screen. It took Eastwood a moment to recognize him. Rick Thompson, a camera operator who had worked on several of his films in the 1990s. "I was just a junior camera guy on the bridges of Madison County," Rick began. "My dad died suddenly during production. I got the call in the middle of a shoot day and just broke down. Mr. Eastwood found me hiding behind a truck, trying to pull myself together." Rick's eyes glistened with tears as he continued. "He not only insisted I go home immediately, but when he found out my family was struggling with funeral costs, he paid for everything. Anonymously. I only found out years later it was him." Rick looked directly into the camera. "He saved my family from going into debt during the worst moment of our lives, and he never wanted anyone to know." Eastwood felt a tightness in his chest. He'd forgotten about that incident, not because it wasn't important, but because it had seemed like the only decent thing to do at the time. The montage continued with similar stories. An actress who had battled addiction spoke about how Eastwood had fought with studio executives to keep her on a film when they wanted to replace her. "He didn't just save my job," she said. "He saved my life. His faith in me made me believe I was worth something." A stuntman talked about how Eastwood had quietly paid for his son's medical treatments when insurance wouldn't cover an experimental procedure. A screenwriter revealed that Eastwood had kept his name on a script, even though the studio had wanted to bring in someone more established to rewrite it. Story after story, face after face, all sharing moments when Eastwood had stepped in to help without fanfare or recognition. Many were incidents he'd forgotten over the years, not because they were insignificant, but because to him, they had simply been the right thing to do. The studio audience had fallen completely silent. Eastwood glanced over and saw that Pete Jackson was watching him rather than the screen, gauging his reaction. The final segment of the video showed something that made Eastwood's breath catch. It was footage from the early 2000s at his daughter's college graduation. The ceremony had ended, and amid the crowd, Eastwood was approached by a young woman he didn't recognize. The cameras, probably there to capture the famous director at the event, had inadvertently recorded their interaction. "Mr. Eastwood?" the young woman said, her voice trembling. "You don't know me, but my father was Jim Kellerman. He was a lighting technician on Absolute Power." Eastwood nodded in the footage, clearly remembering the name. "He died during production. Cancer. I was 12, she continued. You came to our house. You sat with my mom and me and told us stories about my dad, about how respected he was, how good at his job. You made us laugh on the worst day of our lives." The young woman wiped away tears. "You also set up a college fund for me. I never got to thank you, but I'm graduating today because of you." The footage showed Eastwood embracing the young woman. His face turned away from the camera. The video faded to black and the studio lights slowly came back up. The audience remained in stunned silence. Eastwood felt a burning sensation behind his eyes and a tightness in his throat that he hadn't experienced in decades. He wasn't a man who cried easily. His stoic persona wasn't just an act for the cameras, but a genuine reflection of his reserved nature. Yet sitting there, confronted with a lifetime of private moments suddenly made public, he felt something shift inside him. Pete Jackson leaned forward slightly. "Clint, I hope you're not upset that we put this together. These stories, they paint a picture of the man behind the legend that most people never get to see." Eastwood cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "I'm not upset," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Just surprised. These were just normal things. Nothing special." "That's exactly what makes them special," Pete replied. "They weren't done for publicity or recognition. They were done because that's who you are when the cameras aren't rolling. Or at least when you thought they weren't rolling." He smiled gently. Eastwood looked out at the audience. Their faces reflected a mixture of awe and emotion. He noticed several people wiping away tears. "We've invited some special guests here tonight," Pete said. "People whose lives you've touched over the years. People who wanted to thank you in person." Eastwood turned as he heard movement from the side of the stage. A group of people began walking out, faces he recognized from different chapters of his life. The young production assistant from The Mule, who had suffered heat exhaustion. The camera operator whose father's funeral he'd paid for. The actress who had struggled with addiction. The college graduate whose father had died during production. They formed a semicircle behind him, joined by others. Dozens of people whose lives had intersected with his in meaningful ways. Some he recognized immediately. Others took a moment to place. All were smiling at him with unmistakable gratitude. Eastwood felt the burning behind his eyes intensify. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure. But as a lifetime of quiet kindness stood before him in human form, something inside the legendary tough guy finally broke. That first tear broke a dam. Another followed, then another streaming down Eastwood's lined face. For a man who had built his entire career on portraying strength and stoicism, this public display of emotion was unprecedented. The studio fell into a silence so complete you could hear the soft whirring of the cameras. Eastwood didn't try to wipe the tears away or hide his face. He sat there, allowing himself to be vulnerable in front of millions of viewers. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on his knees. A production assistant rushed forward with a box of tissues, but Eastwood waved them away with a small shake of his head. These tears had been earned. He wouldn't brush them aside as if they were something to be ashamed of. Pete Jackson, typically smooth and prepared for any situation, seemed momentarily at a loss. The host had clearly expected some emotion, but perhaps not this raw, honest display from Hollywood's quintessential tough guy. "I don't," Eastwood started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what to say." From the group of people standing on stage, an older woman stepped forward. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her face kind but careworn. Eastwood recognized her immediately. Diane Williams, the script supervisor from Mystic River. Her husband had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer during filming. "You don't need to say anything, Clint," Diane said gently. "We're here to speak for you." She turned to face the audience. 20 years ago, my husband Tom was given 6 months to live. We had no savings, no way to pay for the experimental treatment that might have given him more time. I never told anyone at work. I just couldn't bring myself to talk about it. But somehow Clint found out. She looked back at Eastwood, her eyes bright with tears. He came to me one day, after shooting wrapped, and handed me an envelope. Inside was enough money to cover the treatment and a note that said, "No one should have to choose between time with loved ones and money." Diane's voice wavered. Tom lived another 3 years because of that treatment. 3 years we wouldn't have had otherwise, 3 years to say goodbye properly, to make memories with our grandchildren, to find peace. Eastwood remembered that envelope. He'd asked his assistant to find out the cost of the treatment and had written the check without a second thought. To him, it had simply been the decent thing to do for a valued colleague. Another person stepped forward from the group, a young man in his 30s with a friendly face and confident posture. "My name is David Chen," he said. "I was a production assistant on Gran Torino. It was my first job in the industry and I was terrified. I made a huge mistake during filming, mixed up some crucial footage labels which nearly caused us to lose an entire day's shoot." David looked at Eastwood with a smile. "Anyone else would have fired me on the spot. Instead, Mr. Eastwood took me aside and said, 'Tell me exactly what happened, then tell me how you'd fix it if you could go back.' When I explained, he nodded and said, 'Good. Now you'll never make that mistake again. Let's move on.'" David turned to the audience. "That moment taught me more about leadership than 4 years of film school. Today I'm a production manager, and I try to lead my teams the way Clint led us, with patience, wisdom, and understanding that mistakes are how we learn." One by one, people stepped forward to share their stories. A costume designer spoke about how Eastwood had arranged childcare on set when her babysitter quit unexpectedly during a crucial week of filming. A stunt coordinator told how Eastwood had visited him daily during a 6-month recovery from an on-set accident, bringing books and conversation when everyone else had moved on to the next project. Each story revealed a side of Eastwood that the public had never seen, not the squinting tough guy or the brilliant director, but a man of profound compassion and quiet integrity who never sought recognition for his kindness. As the stories continued, Eastwood's tears didn't stop. They weren't the dramatic sobs of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, steady tears of a man deeply moved by the realization that his small acts of decency had rippled outward in ways he'd never imagined. A middle-aged woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile stepped forward next. "My name is Rachel Turner," she said. "I wasn't part of the film industry at all. I was a waitress at a small diner in Montana where Mr. Eastwood was filming in the late 90s. She glanced at Eastwood with a smile. He came in every morning for breakfast, always ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, always left a generous tip, always knew my name." Rachel's expression grew more serious. What he didn't know was that I was a single mom with a little boy who needed surgery. I was working double shifts trying to save enough money, but it wasn't happening fast enough. She took a deep breath. One morning, Mr. Eastwood overheard me talking to another waitress about it. He didn't say anything, just ate his breakfast, and left. That afternoon, the hospital called me. They said an anonymous donor had paid for my son's entire procedure. Rachel's voice caught. I never said anything because I respected the fact that he wanted to remain anonymous. But my son is now 30 years old and a doctor himself. Every life he saves is, in some small way, because of Clint Eastwood. Eastwood remembered the diner clearly, remembered Rachel and her story about her son. He'd called the hospital from his hotel room, arranged the payment, and never thought about it again, until now. More stories followed, small kindnesses, large gestures, moments of humanity that had been hidden from the public eye for decades. Through it all, Eastwood sat in his chair, no longer trying to hold back his emotion. His usual mask of controlled strength had given way to something more powerful, the strength to be vulnerable. Pete Jackson finally stood and walked to the center of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing tonight is the true measure of a man. Not the characters he's played or the awards he's won, but the lives he's touched when no one was looking. The host turned to Eastwood. Clint, for decades you've kept this side of yourself private. Why? Eastwood took a moment to compose himself, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, but steady. It wasn't anything special, he said. Just the way my parents raised me. You help where you can, you don't talk about it. A woman in her 70s stepped forward from the group on stage. Her silver hair was cut short, her posture straight despite her age. I'm Linda Porter, she said. I was a nurse before I retired. Never worked in film at all. She looked at Eastwood with clear affection. In 1983, my son was an extra on Sudden Impact, just a teenager with one line. During filming, he was diagnosed with leukemia. Linda's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Eastwood heard about it somehow. He came to the hospital. No cameras, no publicity, just him. Sat with my boy for hours telling him stories, making him laugh. When he left, he gave my son his hat from the movie and told him, "You hang on to this for me. I'll come back for it when you beat this thing." She smiled through her tears. My son wore that hat through every chemo session. And when he went into remission a year later, Mr. Eastwood showed up at our house to take him for ice cream. No cameras, no press, just a promise kept. Linda looked directly at Eastwood. My son died 10 years ago, but he lived 30 years longer than the doctors said he would. And he told that story about your kindness until his last day. Eastwood's shoulders shook slightly as a fresh wave of emotion washed over him. These weren't just polite thank yous for career opportunities or professional mentorship. These were stories of profound human connection, of seeing people as people rather than as stepping stones or obstacles on the path to success. The camera panned across the audience, capturing faces streaked with tears. Even the crew members, camera operators, sound technicians, floor managers, we were visibly moved. This wasn't just good television, it was a genuine moment of shared humanity. Pete Jackson stepped forward again. "We have one more person who wanted to be here tonight," he said softly. "Someone who's traveled a very long way to thank you in person." From the wings of the stage, a tall man in his 60s walked slowly toward Eastwood. His face was lined but handsome, his bearing dignified despite a slight limp. He wore a simple dark suit with a white shirt, no tie. Eastwood's eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time since the tears had started, he made a sound, a soft gasp that was picked up by his microphone. The man stopped a few feet away, looking at Eastwood with clear emotion. "Hello, old friend," he said simply. "It's been a long time." A single tear slid down his weathered cheek. For a moment, Eastwood couldn't speak. The man standing before him was Frank Miller, his first stunt double from his early Western days. They had worked together closely for years before a terrible on-set accident had left Frank with a career-ending injury. That had been over 40 years ago. "Frank," Eastwood finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The studio audience watched in rapt silence as Eastwood stood on unsteady legs and embraced his old friend. The two men held onto each other tightly, decades of unspoken emotion passing between them. When they pulled apart, Frank kept a hand on Eastwood's shoulder. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," he said with a small smile. "Remember you?" Eastwood shook his head in disbelief. "How could I forget? We rode together for 7 years." Frank turned to face the audience. "What most people don't know is that Clint and I started in the business around the same time. I was a young stuntman with rodeo experience, and he was a contract actor at Universal. We were both nobodies trying to make a living." Frank's eyes grew distant with memory. "In 1979, we were filming a difficult riding sequence. My horse got spooked by a camera rig and threw me. I landed wrong, broke my back in 3 places. Murmur of sympathy rippled through the audience. The studio's insurance covered the immediate medical bills, but that was it. In those days, there wasn't much protection for stunt performers. Once I couldn't work anymore, I was on my own." Frank's voice caught slightly. "I had a wife, 3 young kids, a mortgage. Everything I'd worked for was slipping away. Frank looked directly at Eastwood. Then something strange started happening. My mortgage payments were being made. Medical bills were getting paid. My kids' college funds somehow had money in them. Eastwood looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the story. For years I didn't know who was behind it, Frank continued. I'd ask my wife if she knew anything and she'd just smile and say we had a guardian angel. It wasn't until 20 years later when my daughter went to work in film accounting that she uncovered the truth. Frank's eyes filled with tears. Every month for over 40 years, Clint Eastwood has been taking care of my family. Never wanted credit, never wanted thanks, never even wanted me to know. The audience gasped collectively. 40 years of silent support was beyond generous. It was extraordinary. Why didn't you ever say anything? Frank asked Eastwood directly, his voice cracking with emotion. Eastwood shrugged, his eyes still wet with tears. It should have been me, he said simply. What do you mean? Frank pressed. That day, on set, we flipped a coin to decide who would do that particular stunt. Eastwood's voice was low but clear enough for the microphones to pick up. You called heads. It was tails. Should have been me on that horse. The studio was completely silent as the weight of this revelation settled over everyone. For 40 years, Eastwood had carried the burden of that coin toss, the random chance that had altered the course of two lives forever. Frank shook his head firmly. That's not how this works, and you know it. Risks were part of my job. What happened wasn't your fault. Maybe not, Eastwood conceded, but what happened after was my responsibility. Frank turned back to the audience, his hand still on Eastwood's shoulder. This man never visited me in the hospital, never sent flowers or called. You know what he did instead? He made sure my family never felt the financial impact of my injury. He did it quietly, consistently, without ever seeking credit or thanks. Frank's voice strengthened. That's who Clint Eastwood really is. Not the tough guy from the movies, not the award-winning director. He's the man who keeps his promises, who takes care of his own, who understands that real strength isn't about never showing weakness, it's about doing what's right, especially when no one's looking. Pete Jackson stepped forward. Frank, you've come a long way to be here tonight. Is there something you wanted to say to Clint? Frank nodded, turning back to Eastwood. From his pocket, he withdrew a small, worn silver dollar. Remember this? Eastwood's eyes widened in recognition. The coin we tossed that day. I've carried it with me every day since the accident, Frank said. Not as a reminder of what I lost, but as a reminder of the friendship that never ended. He held the coin out to Eastwood. I think it's time you carried it for a while. With trembling fingers, Eastwood accepted the coin, closing his hand around it tightly. The audience burst into applause, many rising to their feet. The camera panned, across faces streaked with tears, capturing the raw emotion of the moment. Pete waited for the applause to die down before speaking again. Clint, I know this evening has been unexpected for you. We've seen a side of you tonight that few people knew existed. How are you feeling right now? Eastwood took a deep breath, looking out at the audience, at the people gathered on stage, and finally at Frank. The tears had stopped, but his eyes remained bright with emotion. Uncomfortable, he said with a hint of his familiar dry humor. That earned a gentle laugh from the crowd. But also, grateful. He paused, searching for the right words, something he rarely struggled with as a director but found challenging in this moment of personal vulnerability. When you make films for a living, you learn that what matters isn't the grand speeches or the dramatic moments. It's the small, quiet scenes that reveal character. He looked down at the silver coin in his palm. I guess the same is true in life. Eastwood looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stage at all the people whose lives had intersected with his over the decades. I didn't do anything special. These folks are giving me too much credit. I just tried to be decent. Frank shook his head. That's where you're wrong, old friend. In a town built on ego and image, being genuinely decent is the rarest quality of all. Pete stepped forward again. There's one more thing we'd like to show you, Clint. Something we've been working on behind the scenes. The host gestured to a screen where an image appeared of a new scholarship fund established in Eastwood's name. The Clint Eastwood Foundation for Film Industry Support, Pete announced. A fund dedicated to helping industry workers and their families during times of hardship or crisis. Pete turned to Eastwood. Your children, along with many of the people you've helped over the years, have seeded this foundation with initial donations. It will ensure that the kind of quiet support you've provided throughout your career continues for generations to come. Eastwood looked genuinely surprised. I don't know what to say, he admitted. His daughter Katie stepped forward from where she had been watching in the wings. You don't need to say anything, Dad. Just know that every time this foundation helps someone, it will be an extension of your legacy. Not just the films you've made, but the lives you've touched. She embraced her father tightly as the audience once again rose to their feet in applause. When the applause finally died down, Pete turned to the camera. We've seen something extraordinary tonight. A glimpse behind the carefully constructed image of one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. We've seen that the man known for playing tough, uncompromising characters is in reality a man of profound compassion and quiet integrity. The host turned to Eastwood. Clint, I have just one more question for you. Throughout your career, you've been known for certain catchphrases. Make my day. Do you feel lucky? Lines that captured the essence of strength and determination. After tonight, after seeing this other side of you, I'm wondering if there's something else you might want people to remember you by. Eastwood thought for a long moment. The studio was completely silent, everyone waiting for his response. I guess I'd want them to know that strength isn't about not having emotions, he said finally. Real strength is having the courage to care about something more than yourself. As the show drew to a close, Eastwood remained on stage, surrounded by the people whose lives he had touched. The cameras captured him shaking hands, sharing quiet words, and embracing old friends. There were more tears, not just from Eastwood but from everyone present, including hardened crew members who had seen it all. In living rooms across America, millions of viewers watched in astonishment as the man they had known only as a symbol of tough, uncompromising masculinity revealed himself to be something even more powerful, a human being of extraordinary depth and compassion. And as the credits began to roll, the final shot showed Clint Eastwood, the silver coin gleaming in his palm, surrounded by a lifetime of invisible kindnesses made visible at last. How could I forget? We rode together for 7 years. Frank turned to face the audience. What most people don't know is that Clint and I started in the business around the same time. I was a young stuntman with rodeo experience, and he was a contract actor at Universal. We were both nobodies trying to make a living. Frank's eyes grew distant with memory. In 1979, we were filming a difficult riding sequence. My horse got spooked by a camera rig and threw me. I landed wrong, broke my back in 3 places. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the audience. The studio's insurance covered the immediate medical bills, but that was it. In those days, there wasn't much protection for stunt performers. Once I couldn't work anymore, I was on my own. Frank's voice caught slightly. I had a wife, 3 young kids, a mortgage. Everything I'd worked for was slipping away. Frank looked directly at Eastwood. Then something strange started happening. My mortgage payments were being made. Medical bills were getting paid. My kids' college funds somehow had money in them. Eastwood looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the story. For years, I didn't know who was behind it, Frank continued. I'd ask my wife if she knew anything, and she'd just smile and say we had a guardian angel. It wasn't until 20 years later, when my daughter went to work in film accounting, that she uncovered the truth. Frank's eyes filled with tears. Every month for over 40 years, Clint Eastwood has been taking care of my family. Never wanted credit, never wanted thanks, never even wanted moment. The legendary director realized that tonight's show was going to be very different from anything he had anticipated.